Picture a medieval castle under siege, where amid the chaos, a defiant knight stands atop the battlements, ready to fight to the end. In one legendary standoff in 1152, King Stephen of England threatened to catapult a hostage child against the castle wall unless the garrison surrendered. The boy's father, the knight John Marshal, shocked everyone by coldly replying he still had the hammers and anvils to forge a better son. Incredibly, the king balked, and the child, William Marshal, who would later become famous as the greatest knight of his age, survived. This is just one little anecdote that sets the stage for our journey into the lives of medieval knights who defied kings, broke oaths, and in general just shattered the expectations of their era. We're going far from the courtly paragons of chivalry in the storybooks. We're looking at the rebel knights that lived by their own rules. By turns they were heroic, cunning, cruel sometimes, but above all they were interesting, and they certainly broke the mold of their time. So if you'll spend the next hour with me, we can learn about a few of these rebel knights. Allow me first to welcome you to the channel, though. Good to have you here. And I will begin with the customary thank you to those who are supporting on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who check out the merch store and the occasional donation through Super Thanks and the PayPal link. It's because of you that this entire channel is ad-free, an oasis in the sea of slop. Every time you leave the house these days, or even when you go home, there's advertisements everywhere. I want you to know that you're not going to get them here. In any case, thank you to those supporting. And if you're not in a position to support, well, how about you just like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and tell your friends about it. That's really going to help us out. But all that being said, let's get on with the video now. Well, let's begin in 1066, or rather in the few years after it, this time of Norman conquest. Most of England bowed to William the Conqueror's iron rule, and those who didn't, well, they got the pointy end of it. But there was one region, the Isle of Ely, a swampy enclave of rebel resistance, and they refused to yield. It was here that an English nobleman named Hereward earned the nickname the Wake, meaning the watchful, leading a band of outlaws and refugees in defiance of Norman authority. Now, though he was not a knight in the Norman sense, Hereward was every bit the warrior chieftain, and later folklore would remember him as an archetypal English rebel knight. So that's why we're including him. According to monastic chronicles like the Liber Eliensis and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Hereward had been exiled in his youth and returned to find his family lands seized by invaders. Burning for revenge, he raised a revolt in the Fenlands. And in 1070 to 71, when a Danish fleet briefly joined the English uprising, Hereward and his allies seized the Isle of Ely as a fortress. King William besieged the isle, determined to root out this last annoying little pocket of resistance. And what happened next passed into legend. The Normans were unable to penetrate the treacherous marshes by force, so they resorted to psychological warfare. They erected a wooden siege tower and placed a witch atop it. This sorceress, perched high above the reeds, began hurling curses at the English rebels, loudly prophesying their doom. Interesting strategy, that's for sure, and the Normans hoped that fear and superstition would break the defenders' resolve. But Hereward was not so easily cowed. As the witch chanted, the English launched a sudden counter-attack. They set fire to the dry reeds and rushes of the marsh. One 12th century account claims the flames caught onto the wooden siege tower itself. With a crack of timbers and a billowing of smoke, down the tower went. The unfortunate witch, overcome by fire and fear, fell to her death. The Liber Eliensis tartly records, quote, "She who had come to bring death upon others perished herself first by a broken neck." In the confusion, though, Hereward's men even managed to rout part of the besieging army. King William, unaccustomed to such humiliation, certainly being on quite a winning streak at the time, was said to be furious and deeply unnerved by the failure. That rebel knight of the fens had made the conqueror taste defeat. But ultimately, Ely fell, not through a battle, but through treachery. Bribed monks supposedly guided Norman troops through a secret path, and the rest was pretty unpleasant. But what about Hereward? Well, he narrowly escaped capture. And this is where the arguments begin about what happened. Some sources say he went out in a blaze of glory fighting Normans in the woods later on. Others suggest he accepted a pardon and lived out his days quietly. But whatever the truth is, his exploits were celebrated by later generations as proof that one bold warrior could defy an empire. Hereward the Wake's tale, passed down in chronicles and ballads, set a template for the noble outlaw knight in English lore, a man who fought oppression with wits and courage, unconstrained by the usual bonds of feudal loyalty. Well, let's travel now to medieval Spain, where we meet a knight whose very name became legend, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid Campeador, the Lord Champion. Living in the tumultuous 11th century during the Reconquista, El Cid was a masterful warrior, but he was also a master of his own fate. He served kings when it suited him, but he would just as soon fight for himself, or even for the Muslim emirs if that advanced his goals. In an age when knights swore undying fealty to their lords, El Cid broke the mold by selling his sword to the highest bidder, and ultimately carving out his own principality. Originally a rising favorite in the court of King Alfonso VI of Castile, he earned renown in battles against both Christian rivals and Moorish realms, Moorish being the Muslims, by the way. They would call them the Moors. Well, this prowess won him the honorific Campeador, meaning a champion who had triumphed in single combat. But his very success also bred jealousy. After a dispute involving unauthorized warfare, Rodrigo attacked the Moorish kingdom of Toledo without Alfonso's approval, and earlier had publicly humiliated a powerful noble. King Alfonso exiled him around 1081. And that was when, suddenly cast out from Christian society, El Cid became a knight-errant, leading a band of loyal followers into an uncertain future. But he didn't languish in disgrace. He turned exile into an opportunity. He offered his military genius to the Muslim emir of Zaragoza, and for nearly a decade fought as the emir's champion. So imagine that scene, a Spanish Christian knight commanding an army of Moors against other Christians and their allies. That was practically heresy to some, and fair enough too. But to Rodrigo, warfare was just his job, and political loyalties were negotiable. That being said, the government would throw him under the bus at any turn anyway, so one can hardly blame him for going where the money is. In any case, During these years he defeated formidable enemies, Christian kings of Aragon and Barcelona among them. That enhanced his fame and fortune, while he learned the intricate politics of Al-Andalus. Now the very name El Cid comes from the Spanish Arabic Al-Sayyid, meaning the Lord, a title bestowed upon him by grateful Muslim allies. By the late 1080s, our knight had become a seasoned warlord fluent in both Christian and Islamic courts, a rarity that made him all the more formidable. But fate gave El Cid another chance to shape his own destiny, when a new danger, the fanatical Almoravid Empire in North Africa, swept into Spain. King Alfonso VI, desperate after a disastrous defeat by the Almoravids, recalled El Cid to Christian service. Rodrigo returned briefly to Alfonso's side, but the reunion was short-lived and quite uneasy. Soon he was off again on his own, pursuing the greatest prize of his career, the rich Mediterranean city of Valencia. Through shrewd diplomacy, siege warfare, and occasional treachery, El Cid took Valencia from its Muslim ruler in 1094. He then installed himself as effectively an independent prince. Though he paid lip service to King Alfonso, in practice he ruled Valencia as his personal domain, a Christian lord of a largely Muslim city, even striking coins in his name. So for the remaining years of his life, El Cid held on to Valencia against all newcomers, the Almoravid armies, the rival Spaniards too, cementing a legacy that straddled the line between outlaw and hero. The famous epic poem, El Cantar de mi Cid, composed not long after his death, recounts how he even in death supposedly won a battle. His corpse, armored and set upon his horse, terrified the besieging Moors of Valencia into flight. Now, in reality, after Rodrigo's death in 1099, his widow surrendered Valencia to the Almoravids in 1102. Must have been turning in his grave. Well, the Cid's autonomous lordship had ended. But the fact remains that for a few shining years, a knight with no crown made himself king in all but name. His story is embroidered with many colorful anecdotes reflecting his wiliness. One legendary tale from the epic describes how upon being exiled with nothing, he needed funds to raise an army. He cleverly filled 2 heavy chests with sand and persuaded 2 moneylenders in Burgos to loan him a large sum, telling him the chests were full of gold and jewels as collateral. Well, after Cid rode off, the lenders discovered the trick. But by then he was long gone, leading his mercenaries eastward. Now, whether that's true or not, it captures a popular image of El Cid as a rogue knight who outsmarted foes and friends alike. And despite bending the rules of chivalry, he's remembered in Spain as a kind of national hero, celebrated for his military genius and independent spirit that allowed him to transcend the petty loyalties of kings and kingdoms. He was a man of his own, getting what he wanted from the world. Now that's a trailblazer, if I've ever heard of one. Personifying the rebel knight as a master of his own destiny, loyal ultimately to honor and gain, not to any one lord. Well, let's move on to Crusader times. There's few medieval knights that have more fearsome of a reputation than Reynald of Châtillon, a 12th century French crusader who earned infamy for his ruthless and rebellious streak. Reynald, who's also called Reginald or Renaud, arrived in the Holy Land during the Second Crusade, and soon proved that he bowed to no authority except to his own ambition. Through marriage he became the Prince of Antioch, and later the Lord of Transjordan. but he quarrelled violently with his Christian allies and gleefully violated treaties with Muslim powers. His lawless actions helped to ignite a war that engulfed the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, and it led to catastrophe. Contemporary chronicles, like the Archbishop William of Tyre, condemn Reynald as a troublemaker of insane audacity. Early in his career as the Prince of Antioch, Reynald's greed led him to torture the Latin Patriarch of Antioch in a grotesque bid for money. The story goes that when the Patriarch refused to finance Reynald's military schemes, Reynald had the old churchman stripped naked, smeared in honey, and left exposed on a rooftop under the blazing Levantine sun. Insects swarmed, stinging and biting the cleric, until he agreed to pay a ransom for his release. Now that's a shocking sacrilege. It scandalized even Reynald's fellow crusaders, but it was just a foretaste of his bold disregard for conventions. In 1156, Reynald also launched a brutal raid on Cyprus, which was then a Byzantine Christian island, friendly to the Crusader states. He claimed vengeance for an unpaid debt, but his forces ravaged Cyprus mercilessly, looting towns, burning churches, and allegedly assaulting nuns. Such violence against fellow Christians was unheard of. After all, the Crusades were called as a response to violence on Christians in the Holy Land, and now the Christians were doing the violence. It wasn't meant to be like that, wasn't it? Well, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem was so appalled that he offered to hand Reynald over to the Byzantine Emperor for punishment. Well, Reynald was not going to have that. To save himself, Reynald had to literally grovel for imperial mercy. I'm talking on both knees, kissing the feet. He travelled to Constantinople and reportedly did cast himself at Emperor Manuel's feet with a rope tied around his neck, begging forgiveness. Any sort of cred that he had earned from his exploits certainly gone with that. It's very hard to look cool after that one. Well, I think the Emperor maybe just pitied him, because the Emperor decided to spare him. But that humiliation was seared into memory. William of Tyre wrote, "The glory of the Latins was turned to shame." Fate removed Reynald from the stage for a while. He was captured by Muslim forces in 1161, and he spent the next 15 years rotting in a dungeon in Aleppo. Many likely hoped that that was the end of him. But in 1176 he was released for a hefty ransom or in a prisoner exchange, and he came roaring back into the political scene. He soon married a wealthy heiress, Stephanie of Mealy, which made him Lord of Crac de Mobe and Carac in Transjordan, two crucial castles controlling the caravan routes south of the Dead Sea. He was older, but unrepentant. Reynald now held a position where his recklessness could have even greater impact on the kingdom's fate. And he wasted no time in provoking the Muslim leader Saladin, who by the 1180s had united Egypt and Syria and loomed as the greatest foe of Christendom. When a truce was in place between King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem and Saladin, yes, that's the one with leprosy, Reynald flatly ignored it. In 1181, he attacked a rich caravan traveling between Egypt and Syria. Not an act of war, but more of banditry, and one that violated sworn peace. Now Saladin was understandably furious and demanded that the king of Jerusalem rein in his vassal. But Reynald arrogantly refused to return his plunder. Emboldened, he then undertook one of the most daring and, to Muslimize, sacrilegious exploits of the age. He built ships, had them carried in pieces on camelback to the Red Sea, and in 1182 launched a pirate fleet. Reynald's crews raided ports and preyed on merchant vessels, spreading panic that the Crusaders might even strike the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. One raiding party actually reached the town of Rabig, not far from Mecca itself, before Saladin's navy hunted them down. Now this audacity, a Frankish lord desecrating the Red Sea, Islam's home waters, escalated Saladin's determination to annihilate the Crusader presence. Even fellow Crusaders viewed Reynald as a liability, yet he continued to play kingmaker. In 1186, after the death of Baldwin IV and his nephew Baldwin V, Reynald supported the controversial coronation of Gilles de Rais as King of Jerusalem. That same year, Reynald struck another caravan, reportedly capturing Saladin's sister in the process. Well, this final outrage pushed tensions to the breaking point. Saladin swore an oath to personally kill Reynald for his treachery. War erupted in 1187, with Saladin invading the kingdom of Jerusalem on a mission with a bit of revenge and conquest mixed together. The climax came at the Battle of Hattin in July of 1187, where Saladin's forces crushed the Crusader army. Reynald of Châtillon was among the captives brought before Saladin. The Sultan offered a drink of iced water to the defeated King Guy of Lusignan as a sign of mercy. But when Guy handed the cup to Reynald, Saladin intervened. Sharing a drink symbolized a promise of life, and Saladin had no intention of sparing Reynald. Facing the man who had tormented his people and defied every code of honor, Saladin reminded Reynald of his crimes. And then, keeping his vow, Saladin drew his sword and personally beheaded Reynald. One chronicle describes Saladin's strike cutting through Reynald's shoulder. His guards finished the grisly work of decapitation. The other Crusader captives looked on in stunned silence as Reynald's lifeless body was dragged away. And thus ended the tale of Reynald of Châtillon, a knight who gained infamy as a pirate, a warmonger, and an oath-breaker. In the aftermath, Christian writers often blamed Reynald for having brought ruin on the kingdom by goading Saladin into war. And they're quite right to do so. Because indeed, within months of Hattin, Jerusalem fell, and the Crusader kingdom went into its death spiral. Reynald's rebellious career shows how one unprincipled knight, acting out of greed and arrogance, could ruin the entire plan, altering the course of history forever. He is remembered as the epitome of the rogue knight. Fearless, lawless, but ultimately self-destructive. But not all rebel knights fought solely with the sword. Some wielded words just as lethally. Our next story is about Bertrand de Born, a 12th century Occitan knight from France's Limousin region, famed both as a warrior and as a troubadour poet. He used his poetry to stir up conflict and rebellion, earning himself a lasting infamy. In fact, Dante Alighieri placed Bertrand in hell as a sower of discord in his work The Divine Comedy, which I did do a 14-hour reading of, by the way, if you're interested in that. Well, Bertrand's life demonstrates how a knight could defy the social order, not only by direct action, but by cunning manipulation and incendiary rhetoric. Let's get a bit of background first. Bertrand was lord of the castle of Montfort, and from the start, he proved to be quite quarrelsome. He fought a protracted civil war against his own brother for control of their family lands. More consequentially, Bertrand involved himself in the tumultuous Angevin politics of King Henry II of England's dominions in France. The Plantagenet royal family was beset by rivalry. Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and others, repeatedly rose in rebellion against their father. Bertrand de Born took full advantage of the strife. He became fast friends with Henry the young king, Henry II's eldest surviving son, by the way, and egged him on in revolt. Contemporary chroniclers accuse Bertrand of being an instigator behind the scenes. He penned verses glorifying warfare, and even satirical political poems mocking peace. In one of his poems, Bertrand exalted that, quote, "I love the joyous time of Easter, that makes the leaves and flowers come out, and I love to see on the meadows tents and pavilions spread." Now, of course, he's referring to an encampment. Seems to revel in the sights and sounds of battler's delight. This warrior poet idealized the chaos of feudal conflict. According to legend, he addressed the young king as "my lord," and encouraged him not to submit to his father's will. Some later writers even claimed Bertrand's tongue was the serpent that poisoned the bond between Henry and his heir, though this may exaggerate the role. There were plenty of genuine grievances that drove the rebellions. He just didn't make it any better. Nevertheless, Bertrand fought alongside Henry the young king in the rebellion of 1173 to 74, and again in 1183. And while King Henry II eventually crushed these uprisings, and the young king died of dysentery during the campaign of 1183, on his deathbed, the prince reportedly expressed regret and asked for his father's forgiveness. King Henry, in his grief, came to believe that Bertrand de Born's meddling had helped turn his son against him. There is that old saying, "Your child is only one friend away from complete disaster." One medieval account has Henry II memorably declaring that Bertrand had always sought to kindle war, and that his songs had kindled the fire of strife between father and son. Well, the fallout for Bertrand was severe. After losing his patron and ally, he was besieged by none other than Richard the Lionheart, who at the time was still loyal to his father. Richard stormed Bertrand's castle and briefly sent Bertrand to prison. Facing the wrath of the Angevin king, Bertrand changed tune and begged for clemency. He supposedly composed a humble lament for the king's death that moved Henry II to mercy. According to a possibly apocryphal story, Henry II himself restored Bertrand's lands after hearing his contrite verses, a testament to the power of poetry even in war. So Bertrand de Born thus survived his brush with royal fury, and when Richard the Lionheart later rebelled in turn and became king in 1189, Bertrand served Richard and even went on the Third Crusade with him. The restless troubadour knight continued to stir up trouble in King Richard's quarters with King Philip II of France, writing biting satires urging Richard to war. Only in his old age did Bertrand retire to a monastery, perhaps seeking spiritual absolution for his lifetime of troublemaking. Now, we mentioned Dante Alighieri. He was writing over a century later and delivered the final verdict on Bertrand's legacy. In Dante's Inferno, that is Canto 28, the poet meets Bertrand de Born among the sowers of discord in the eighth circle of hell. Bertrand is depicted carrying his severed head like a lantern, a symbolic punishment for a man whose scheming tongue tore apart the bond between Henry II and his son. Dante has Bertrand's damned soul proclaim, quote, "Thus I carry my brain, alas, separated from its source which is in this trunk. In me you may see the perfect contrapasso," contrapasso being punishment fitting the sin. Well, it's this final gruesome image that immortalized Bertrand as the archetype of the knight who glorified and incited rebellion. But history might treat Bertrand de Born with a little bit more nuance than Dante's poetic justice allows. He was, after all, acting in a feudal world, where rebellion was just another tool of ambitious nobles, and many shared blame in the conflicts he joined. Yet his own contemporaries recognized a dangerous cleverness in him. He blurred the line between knight and propagandist, showing how a sharp pen could amplify the impact of a sword. In any case, Bertrand's life reminds us that not all rebel knights were outcasts, or I suppose we could say lone wolves. Some like him thrived in the world of noble politics, using their wit and a little bit of violence interchangeably to shape events to their liking. Now let's look at another one. By the 13th century, discontent with royal rule sometimes led to entire factions of knights and nobles collectively rebelling. The figurehead of one of the most dramatic of such uprisings was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, a French-born nobleman who became the leader of England's barons in a revolt against King Henry III. Montfort's rebellion, the Second Barons' War between 1264 and 67, wasn't a selfish grab for power alone. It had an ideological tinge, aiming to reform the realm's governance. But in the process, Simon de Montfort showed how a rebel knight could, at least for a time, wield more authority than the king himself. Simon de Montfort was a younger son of a famous crusader family. His father led the Albigensian crusade in southern France, one of the more dirtier crusades, I think. Simon came to England, married King Henry III's sister, and rose to prominence at court. Initially a trusted advisor, he later grew critical of the king's mismanagement and favoritism toward the foreign courtiers. Many English barons shared those grievances, which centered on heavy taxation and the erosion of feudal rights. Eventually, discord led to the Provisions of Oxford in 1258, an attempt by the baronial party to impose a constitutional framework on the king. Montfort was at the forefront of pressing Henry III to accept these reforms. When the king backtracked on the agreements, Montfort and his allies raised armies. Civil war erupted in 1264, and despite being in his mid-50s, a very advanced age for battlefield command then, Simon de Montfort proved to be an energetic and capable general. At the Battle of Luz in May of 1264, he led the baronial forces to a stunning victory over the royal army. King Henry III and his son Prince Edward, the future Edward I, were captured, and in the aftermath, Montfort was made the de facto ruler of England. He did something extraordinary then. He summoned a parliament in 1265 that, for the first time in English history, included not only nobles and clergy, but also commoners, town burgesses, knights of the shires, etc. This Montfort's Parliament is often celebrated as a pioneering step towards parliamentary democracy, and you can imagine the scene in Westminster. The rebel Earl, stern yet idealistic, surrounded by knights and citizens deliberating over the kingdom's governance, or while a captive king watched on as a bystander. It was a revolutionary inversion of the social order, a subject effectively dictating to his sovereign. Montfort's regime, however, made him many enemies. Some barons feared he was becoming a tyrant himself, and others simply saw an opportunity to regain royal favor. In 1265, Prince Edward escaped captivity and rallied royalist forces. A decisive clash came at the Battle of Evesham in August of 1265. Montfort, vastly outnumbered, faced the king's army in what he reportedly called a death for God's sake, fighting bravely alongside his loyal knights, including his own son. Montfort was defeated and then killed right there on the battlefield. The royalists, bent on vengeance, subjected his corpse to a horrific indignity. His body was mutilated, hacked apart, limb from limb. Chroniclers record that his head and his hands and his feet were all cut off. One of his severed body parts, accounts differ whether it was his head or another piece, was even sent to a noble lady who loathed him, as a grotesque kind of trophy. So deep was the hatred that Montfort's memory was officially damned by the victors, at least for a time. Yet despite this grisly end, the popular opinion on Montfort was remarkably favourable in many quarters. To the commons and the church, he had been a champion of justice, so much that rumours of miracles at his grave circulated in the years after his death. Some townspeople and monks quietly revered him, almost as a saintly martyr who died for England's liberties. Though the crown tried to suppress such veneration, after all he was a traitor in royal eyes, the idea of Montfort as a righteous rebel lived on. Centuries later, historians would praise him as the founder of the House of Commons for his parliamentary innovations. Simon de Montfort's rebellion shows the dual faces of a knight's legacy. On one hand, he was a traitor who broke his oath to the king and met a traitor's fate. On the other hand, his cause, reforming royal government, was vindicated in the long run, and his method, calling an assembly of the realm, set a precedent for more representative governance. Montfort operated in the grey space between feudal obligation and higher principles. His life and death illustrate how a rebel with a clear vision, a strong sword arm that is, could, albeit briefly, remake the political order. But they also warn that medieval power struggles were unforgiving. Even a noble cause might end on the cutting block if fortune turned against you. But of course, no video about rebel knights is complete without the Scottish Wars of Independence, where knights fought to throw off the English domination. In the late 13th century, Sir William Wallace emerged as a leader of a Scottish resistance against King Edward I of England. Wallace was a minor noble, some say not even knighted until later. But in 1297, he rallied common Scots and fellow knights to rise up. In September of that year, he won a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, using strategy and the terrain. Wallace's smaller force ambushed the English as they crossed a narrow bridge, routing a much larger army. In the wake of this triumph, Wallace was knighted, and he was named Guardian of Scotland, effectively heading the government in the name of the exiled Scottish king. However, the success was short-lived. In 1298, Edward retaliated with a massive invasion and defeated Wallace's forces at Falkirk. Wallace slipped into guerrilla warfare and reportedly even travelled abroad seeking support. But eventually, he was betrayed. In 1305, the English captured him and put him on trial for treason. Wallace famously denied being a traitor, having never sworn loyalty to Edward. But he was condemned anyway. His execution was especially cruel. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Wallace was strangled by hanging, but cut down alive, and then he was mutilated and beheaded, his severed head displayed on London Bridge, and his limbs were sent to Scottish towns as a grim warning. Rather than break Scottish resolve, Wallace's martyrdom only deepened it. He became a symbol of defiance, inspiring his countrymen in death. And so Scotland's fight continued under Robert the Bruce, a nobleman of royal blood who had initially cooperated with the English. In 1306, Bruce made a fateful decision to turn rebel. He quarrelled with his political rival John Comyn and killed him at a church altar, and then quickly seized the crown of Scotland for himself. King Edward I branded Bruce a traitor and a murderer, and Bruce had to flee into the Highlands when Edward's armies overran his coronation site. But Bruce did not give up. Over the next few years, he waged a dogged guerrilla campaign, gradually winning back castles and territories from English control. And his turning point came in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, when Robert the Bruce outnumbered Scottish knights and spearmen achieved a decisive victory against Edward II, the late Edward I's son. Bannockburn was one of the greatest upsets in medieval military history. Robert's strategy and the fierce resolve of his knights shattered the larger English army and secured Scotland's independence. In the years after, Robert solidified his rule, and eventually the English crown agreed to recognize Scotland's sovereignty. And so Robert the Bruce, once a rebel in hiding, reigned as an acknowledged king until his death in 1329. His journey from outlawed knight to victorious monarch showed that a rebellion, if successful, could be recast as patriotism. And together, the stories of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce showed two sides of the fight for freedom. One knight paid with his life. Another got a crown. But not all rebel knights fought over crowns or countries. Some took up arms for religious reform and paid the price. Let's talk about Sir John Oldcastle, an English knight and one-time friend of King Henry V. But he also became a leader of the Lollards, a proto-Protestant religious movement critical of the Catholic Church. Oldcastle's convictions drove him to rebellion against the king he had once served, making him an early martyr figure for the cause of reform, but also a traitor in the eyes of the crown. Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, had distinguished himself in an early career. He was a veteran soldier who fought bravely in King Henry IV's wars against the Welsh and in France. He was a jovial companion to Prince Hal, the future Henry V, in the prince's wilder youth. Shakespeare later immortalized a fictionalized version of this prince and knight camaraderie in the character of Falstaff, originally named Oldcastle in the early drafts, until protests from Oldcastle's descendants forced a change. But unlike Shakespeare's cowardly comic Falstaff, the real Oldcastle was serious-minded and devout. By around 1410, Oldcastle had embraced Lollardry, a movement inspired by John Wycliffe's teachings. Lollards advocated for scriptures in English, criticized the wealth of the church, and questioned doctrines like transubstantiation. Now, transubstantiation, by the way, is basically, from my understanding, you know how they do the wine for the blood and the crackers for the body? Well, they say that, well, once you drink the wine, once it goes into your body, it literally turns into the blood of Christ. Same with the crackers. Once you eat the crackers, you swallow them, well, then it turns into the body of Christ. That's transubstantiation. If anyone wants to correct me in the comments, please go ahead. It's probably a bit more complicated than that. Well, in any case, this put them on a collision course with the church authorities and the monarchy, which saw heresy as a threat to social order. Initially, because of Oldcastle's favour with Prince Hal, he was shielded from prosecution. However, once Henry V became king in 1413, he felt obliged to crack down on heresy to please the church and solidify his rule. In 1413, Oldcastle was arrested and tried for heresy. Presented with articles of faith to recant, he refused. The chroniclers say that in dramatic interrogation, Oldcastle defended his Lollard beliefs unabashedly. He was convicted as a heretic and sentenced to burn. But he managed a daring escape from the Tower of London just a few days before his execution. Now a wanted outlaw, Oldcastle did not flee the country as some might. Instead, he organized a plot to overthrow King Henry V. He and fellow Lollards planned an uprising in early 1414. They would gather secretly at St. Giles Fields outside London, incite the populace, capture the king, and enforce reform, perhaps even instilling a more sympathetic ruler or a council. Henry V, forewarned of the conspiracy, ambushed the would-be rebels, and the result was chaos. Dozens of Lollards arrested and later executed. But Oldcastle slipped away, yet again, becoming a fugitive for several years. The king issued proclamations for his capture, painting him as a diabolical traitor. Oldcastle, for his part, allegedly plotted to kidnap the king on multiple occasions, and maintained clandestine contacts with other dissenters. He evaded capture through a mix of luck and help of sympathetic commoners who sheltered him. Finally, in late 1417, Sir John Oldcastle was betrayed and seized in Wales. And by this time, Henry was in France waging war, the Agincourt campaign and beyond. The English authorities were keen to eliminate this lingering source of sedition, so Oldcastle was brought to London and condemned, both as a traitor and a heretic, a double damnation that the Church and Crown reserved for someone who challenged both spiritual and monastic order. In December of 1417, Oldcastle was hanged over a fire and burned alive. This method, simultaneous hanging and burning, was unusual and symbolically potent, signifying punishment for both treason and heresy. You'd be hanged for treason and burned for the heresy, so best of both worlds, I suppose. Oldcastle died, reportedly still steadfast in his faith, forgiving his executioners. To the establishment chroniclers, he was a cautionary tale of prideful insurrection. But later Protestant writers in the Reformation, a century afterward, hailed Oldcastle as a forerunner of the cause. The good Lord Cobham, who died for the true faith against a corrupt church and a tyrant king. Well and truly by the side of the Lord in heaven, as they say. Now, this rebellion was thus rooted in ideology more than in feudal politics or ambition. He wasn't trying to become a king, he wasn't trying to get rich, he was just doing what he thought was right spiritually. But it does demonstrate that the knightly class, typically seen as pillars of the old order, could also harbor new ideas. And when those ideas collided with loyalty to a king, Oldcastle chose principle over allegiance. A pretty unusual and risky stance for a knight. Now I think we've saved the best till last. Chivalry held that a true knight should protect the innocent and uphold virtue. But the next figure grotesquely inverted that ideal. Gilles de Rais, a French knight of the 15th century, went from celebrated war hero to a perpetuator of some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And while not a rebel in the political sense, Gilles rebelled against every moral and religious law, committing evil on a scale that made him a rebel against humanity itself. Once, Gilles de Rais was the kind of knight young men idolized. Born to great wealth, and titled Baron de Rais, he even fought alongside Joan of Arc in 1429 during the 100 Years' War. At about 25 years old, Gilles distinguished himself by his fearless fighting in battles such as the Relief of Orléans. He was honored with the title Marshal of France, one of the highest military ranks, as a reward for his service, and by all appearances he was a shining example of French knighthood, brave, devout, and loyal to King Charles VII, at least outwardly. But after the war, things changed. Gilles de Rais had extravagant tastes. He maintained a private army and spent lavishly on luxuries, theatrical pageants, and alchemical experiments. His fortune began to dwindle, and he quarreled with family over his reckless spending. In an attempt to recoup wealth or gain forbidden knowledge, he turned to the occult. He patronized sorcerers or alchemists that promised the secrets of the philosopher's stone or demonic summoning to find hidden treasure. And it was during this period that Gilles began a hidden career of unspeakable crime, the kidnapping, sexual abuse, and murder of children. Rumors whispered of a missing peasant boy last seen near Gilles' castle. It took years for suspicions to surface publicly, partly because de Rais was a noble with the power to intimidate or silence accusers. But by 1440, the Bishop of Nantes had gathered enough testimony to take action. Arrested and put on trial, Gilles de Rais eventually confessed, under threat of torture, by the way, to a catalogue of horrors. According to the trial accounts, he admitted to sacrificing over 100 children. Some accounts say possibly 200, in a perverse spree spanning over 8 years. He and his accomplices would lure young boys and occasionally girls from the countryside by offering food or employment as pages. The children, as young as 6 years old, were then brutally violated, killed, and their bodies burned in the furnaces. The descriptions from witnesses and Gilles' own confessions are quite ghastly, detailing how he derived sadistic pleasure from the rituals of torture and death. The court and spectators were aghast that a man of noble blood, a knight who fought under the sacred banner of Joan of Arc, could commit such abominations. Some wondered if madness or demonic influence had overtaken him. Gilles remained unrepentant until facing imminent execution, when he made a final show of penitence. In October 1440, he was hanged and burned. His ashes were then cast into the river, as if to erase his presence from the earth. The shocking case of Gilles de Rais sent tremors through medieval society. Here was a knight who broke the code of chivalry in the most extreme way possible. Instead of protecting the weak, he preyed upon them. Instead of honoring God, he was said to have invoked devils. It was a betrayal of everything that knighthood stood for. and yet it happened under cover of Gilles' lofty status. Many historians consider Gilles de Rais as one of history's first documented serial killers, and we've talked about him a bit in the Serial Killers of Medieval France video. His trial transcripts survive too, allowing us to hear the voices of medieval peasants who tearfully recounted how their children vanished, and of servants who stumbled upon charred bones in their master's fireplace. But hold your horses. It is worth noting that some later skeptics have speculated whether Gilles might have been a victim of a political or a church plot, just as Joan of Arc had been. But the weight of evidence and his own admission strongly support his guilt. Indeed, Gilles' close association with Joan of Arc made his fall from grace all the more jarring. You see, Joan was seen as a pure saviour of France, whereas Gilles became a cautionary tale of how even the highest, the noblest, could fall into depravity. His story was sometimes linked in popular imagination to the legend of Bluebeard, a wife-murdering noble in fairy tales, and has served as a morality play. Even those who once fought for good can be consumed by evil if they rebel against the laws of God and man. So, what did you think? Which one was your favorite rebel knight? For me, it's Hereward the Wake. It has to be, right? Because he didn't really do anything wrong, and maybe we don't want to call him a knight, but still, I thought it's best to put him in. He deserves it. He's sort of up there with Vercingetorix, I think. Or maybe even Ariovistus. Well, we won't go on about that. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters now. Reason why you didn't get any ads. These good, kind people. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, where are we? Brandon, Cuckoo Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf's Vein, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Bestie Hunt, Stevie, and Jessica. Thank you so much. Well, that's it for me for now. I hope you enjoyed it. Rebel Knights, Pretty cool, I think. Thanks for joining me. Lots of love to you all around the world. And I will see you when you feel inclined to return. You know where I'll be. Right here on YouTube. I never leave. I never sleep. Good night.